Hello modellers, I'm Matt the Inner Nerd, and in this video I'm going to both show and tell you how I built, painted and weathered Kinetic's new F-16A. So let's get into it. So this kit is an all new mould from Kinetic, and those of you who remember the disastrous end their old kit had in my hands will be pleased to see that I actually finished this one. If you missed that video, then go back to my channel and go and check that out. Now, like I said, this kit is all new and the Kinetic F-16 lineup is growing fast. From this A version to the B's, C's and D's, the whole lineup basically. We start with the Cockpit as usual sequence on aircraft models, and I use a mix of Tamiya regular and extra thin cement to glue the parts together. I tend to use the regular one for small parts and more accuracy. And on first impressions of the kit, it seems to be going together a treat. Just a light sand with 800 grit sandpaper to tidy the parts up from the sprue, and that's it to get it to fit in. A few small adjustments with the chisel as well to delete the lumps and bumps of other versions of the aircraft that I'm not making. There are some ejector pin marks inside the intake, but these won't be visible once the parts are assembled inside the model. With as many sub-assemblies made as I can, I get to work on priming them with Mr. Surfacer 1500 in black. I thin this with Mr. Colour Leveling Thinner to about 50% with a nice smooth flow through the airbrush. To smooth the seam on the intake, I use Mr. Dissolve Putty, which is a very thin filler which can be applied with a brush. It's lacquer based, so it can be cleaned up with lacquer thinner, or I use acetone. I sanded that smooth with 1200 grit sandpaper and recoated with the white paint. The cockpit was sprayed from a top down angle to create some false shadows between the top layers and the floor. I only misted the colour over the side sections so that more black would be showed through, giving the area a sense of depth. With the switches, I found it easier to mask off the area and then recoat in black, ready to receive a dry brush with light grey to pick out the edges. This creates even more depth inside an otherwise flat cockpit. The dry brushing technique was used again on the intake fan using Citadel paints. These Citadel paints are really good for metallic or bright colours and are designed for brush painting, so if you're looking for some good brush paints, I'd recommend taking a look at these. Keeping the dry brush out, I detail the exhaust using a mix of sand and brown colours. This matched the reference I was using well, and the dry brush technique worked well on these detailed kit parts. One thing I would do differently here though is to actually assemble the whole exhaust rather than having it part assembled like I have here. I had a few problems getting it completely rounded when I come to put them together later down the line. The main pieces of the build threw up very few problems. Just the fit of the wheel bay was tough, but soon rectified with a shove against the rearmost bulkhead to slot it in position and the gap you see closed. Overall a pretty good fit, but it could have been better if it had tackled the nose section a bit more carefully and fitted those side panels after the main nose section. The misalignment cost me time filling, sanding and rescribing lost details I could have actually avoided. I filled problem areas with Tamiya putty and used silicone brush applicator to spread it onto the model. Masking tape is good for keeping the mess to a minimum and saving rescribing from any rogue filler. I mixed Panaline wash using Winsor & Newton oil paint and White Spirit enamel thinner. This has nothing to do with weathering, but is a check before any primer goes down to see the state of the panel lines after building. Some can get lost after sanding, and this is a good way to highlight them before any paint gets sprayed. And as expected, there were a few areas that needed to be rescribed, so I did this using the CMK razor saw and the scribe pin balanced along some electrical tape. Now that I'm happy with the state of the model, I need to lay down some primer ready for the paint. I use Mr. Surfacer 1000 in grey, and this is thin to around 50% with self-leveling thinner. I spray that onto the model in even coats, building up the layers carefully. You don't need to lace the primer on, just cover the model until the plastic's no longer visible. I also primed the exhaust section with Ammo's new A-Stand Gloss Black Primer, which I have to say is by far the best gloss black I've ever seen. I mean, just look at the shine on that. There was a nasty seam along the canopy which was easily fixed with 3000 grit sanding sponge followed by Tamiya's polishing compounds which run through course to finish. It works exactly the same as car polish, which you can use as a substitute because these are quite hard to find. I buffed the canopy with the compounds using Glasses cleaning cloth. Okay, so a new technique for me here, and I'll give Luftraum72, I hope I've pronounced that right, on Instagram a shout out for this exact technique. But this is a development of a technique I tried with oils on my 32 scale 109 build last year, or the year before, I can't remember. The idea behind this is to use artist inks. I'm using ones by Pabio, yeah, just make sure they're acrylic based. And you mix them with Tamiya X-20A acrylic thinner to create a multi-layered mottle to base the painting layers. The first step is to lay on X-20A directly onto the model. No need to flood it, just make it wet. Then apply the ink thinly. No need to soak it through or it's not going to work. Then let it dry off until you can touch it. That's going to take around 5 or 10 minutes at room temperature, or you can be sped up with a hairdryer. Just don't leave it overnight or this is going to take forever. Then with a larger, preferably stiff but bristly brush, dampen with the Tamiya acrylic thinner, tap the surface of the ink until you see it start to disperse. The key here is to be very gentle with it, like you're trying to high-five a bumblebee. You don't want to knock that guy over. You can keep doing this tapping motion until you start to see the ink dry up again in its now mottled state. You can always go back over an area that you don't like using the same technique, but the idea is to have a relatively uneven surface of lights and darks created by the various concentrations of the white ink. Layer 1 of the ink is complete and it's now time to blend that in using the colour for the model. In this case of the F-16, it's light ghost grey from MRP. You can see that it's barely doing anything, but from my angle when spraying you can see the sheen from the paint and the mottling underneath slightly disappearing beneath the paint. This is a comparison between one layered with paint and just white ink. Okay, very important part of the process is to seal the previous layers in with gloss coat that isn't acrylic base. I use 2 thin layers of Mr. Colour GX100 which is lacquer based. Anything acrylic will be removed by the X20A from the inking process which comes up next. The underside is now complete, so I add the camouflage of the special Belgian F-16 on the top side. This layer is going to look fresh, so I ignore the ink underneath and lay the paint on evenly to cover it. To keep the tape from peeling off any paint, since it's going to be covering a large area, I use the forehead of mottling to take away that tack. I mean, if you've got a super greasy forehead, that's going to be too much, but if you just rinse your face in water and this will take off just enough tack while still being sticky enough. The second layer of the inking process is when the black goes on, and it's at this point you think, am I doing this right or have I just written off all that work? But trust the process, it'll work out. Promise. I do exactly the same as I did with the white layer, lay down X28 followed by the black ink, then let it dry off, mottle with a stiffy brush, dampen with X20A thinner and done. A pointer I can give is not to add too much thinner to the stiffy brush. Too much will flood the surface and basically just wash the ink away or tide it into one massive puddle. You just want to disturb the ink just enough so it dissipates, no more than that. The final step is to smooth out the surface of any imperfections like bumps and brush hairs with the 3000 grit sanding sponge. Embrace that bumblebee high five touch again for this one, or you'll quickly rub through the paint and all will be lost. It's time to paint again and use the colours of the top side to finish off the process. It's just painting, there's not really any special technique to what I'm doing. It just requires patience and an eye to see the ink layers below metaphorically dissolve into the top colour. sprayed the landing gear bays, I used a slightly darker shade of off-white to base them. This meant that I could highlight the details by dry brushing proper white once it had dried. Moving on to the decals, I chose this special anniversary scheme from Cyhart Decals celebrating 75 years of the Belgian 350th Squadron, which is a fighter squadron of the Belgian Armed Forces. It was originally formed in 1941 as part of the Royal Air Force during World War II. The unit was transferred to the Belgian Air Force in 1946. The unit is now part of the 2nd Tactical Wing and operates F-16 Fighting Falcons. I like it because it has RAF style camouflage on it and both the Belgian Air Force roundel as well as one from the RAF. There are a few stragglers on the no-walk areas, so I cut the ends with a scalpel and carefully remove with tape to neaten them up. Don't touch any other decal while you're doing this or they'll come along for a ride as well. The decals from Cyhart were good, but they did leave behind a raised area around the decal itself. This can be flattened back into the surrounding paint using 3000 grit sanding sponge and more of that high-fiving pressure. We're coming to the end of the model now, so let's bring it to life through some tasteful weathering. The first step is to seal everything I've done so far with semi-gloss clear. This one is lacquer based from Mr. Hobby and thinned 50% with self-leveling thinner. The semi-gloss will allow the oils to stick a bit more than the gloss, and lacquer won't react with the oil-based products I'll be using. The first effect I'm going to replicate is in-field repairs made by the crew. As I understand, these are usually done with whatever grey spray paint is available in the locker, and most of the time it's not the same one as on the plane. So I mask off areas using a reference photo as a guide using masking fluid. Then, not trying to spray around the outside of the liquid mask, but more like filling in the masked sections. That'll allow the overspray to just edge around the masking so it looks faded. Next up is to use a selection of oils for streaks and stains. It might look like a big lineup, but this selection will give you a range of colours needed for modern military aircraft. Several shades of grey, with an accent colour of green or blue to change the hue slightly. And this weather is never random. It's always a good idea to use and follow a reference photo when you're doing this sort of thing, so that the model doesn't easily get overpowered with your excitement of just a little bit here and just a little bit more there. To get a base down for the weathering, a roadmap if you like, I start with the dot filter using several shades of grey. Some light, some dark, but never black. Black doesn't really exist in real life, and it always a shade of brown, blue or green. Not using black will really make your model pop. Trust me. The dot filter is streaked with a flat brush, dampened with enamel thinner and slowly blended into the background paint. You want to keep this going until it's basically no longer visible. Sounds pointless applying it, but it works when it's dry. After that, I added some sections of lighter oils directly onto the model with no thinner. These can be blended in using a soft dry brush which is completely without thinner. This brush will soften the oil and fade it into the background to become a stain. More staining can be applied in the form of a local wash. The oil can be applied raw onto the model, then manipulated with a brush dampened with enamel thinner to move it around and dissipate the oil into the panel lines. It's the same kind of technique I use in the ink layering process, but this time on a more concentrated area and with oil. I repeated this process over the wing using different shades of paint to build up the texture and depth to the effect. Pay attention to the references and use that as a guide to keep everything in check. We want this to look nice and balanced. It's also important to keep the brush clean during this process, so I dip it in white spirit now and then once I find that the oil isn't working as I'd like on the surface of the model. On the newly painted section of the tail, I wanted to add a bit of depth since the paint was just too flat. I mixed the wash using the same oil paints I've been using for the other effects and enamel thinner. Then applied that onto the panel lines before removing with a cotton pad after they'd gone touch dry. Using similar colours to the paint helped keep this effect to a minimum and become more of a shadow than the weathering effect. The underside got the same treatment with the oils. This time I had a small amount of burnt umber to the mixes of paint to give it a greasy tone. Again using a good reference which you can find on my Pinterest board, which is linked in the description below. You don't need a whole fleet of skills here, and you've probably noticed I'm just doing the same technique throughout the entire model, just stacking the layers to create the different effects. But I'm not doing anything groundbreaking. Be careful with your colour choice and layer in a way that you would see on your references. Take a long, good look. Try and work it out, then just copy what you see. And for those of you thinking no crew chief would ever blah blah, then This method of oil rendering is also good for creating false shadows, which helps create depth on a piece. This drop tank can look more three-dimensional when I add light grey to the upper surfaces while leaving the underside in the original colour. This is blended live on the model in the same way that I've been doing throughout the weathering process. The final assembly was quite complicated with this being a jet, and just to make sure that things stuck down solid for the first time, I used 5-minute epoxy glue. This is a 2-part glue, 1 part hardener and 1 part glue, mixed together and an open time of 5 minutes to get things in place. Have to say it worked a treat, and I've popped a link in the description for that on Amazon. Whilst I'm talking about Amazon actually, all the tools I'm using are linked in the description below. If you follow those links, I'll be able to get a small commission from your purchase with no additional charge to you. It massively helps the channel, and I'd appreciate if you'd use that link to buy stuff. A nice little detail for all those knocked off static wicks was to borrow my girlfriend's toothbrush, cut off a few hairs and stick them on using Ammo's Ultra Glue. This one's in matte as well, so you don't need to get that shine on the matte surface of the model. I like to unify the surface of the model with one smooth sheen, so I use Mr. Colour semi-gloss clear varnish over the entire model before applying the canopy and other clear parts with the Ultra Glue again. And with the canopy on, that was the end of the build and a wrap for 2024. I've got some nice plans for model making in 2025 with some prop action, and it's soon coming to my 100th video, which I'll need some help deciding what to do for it. So if you've got any ideas, let me know down in the comments. It could be a kit to make, a particular scheme to do, a special The Greatest Hits video, I don't know. But remember to read one another's comments too and like the ones you see. That'll help me gauge the level of interest between each suggestion. But until then, I wish you a very happy Christmas for those who celebrate it, a happy new year to you all, and I hope that Father Christmas brings all of your modelling dreams. I'm Matt, the Inner Nerd, and this has been my build of Kinetic's new F-16A. Thanks for watching. Hello there. Matt again, just wanted to say if you like this video, let YouTube know by giving it a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. I'm closing in on 100k now, so it'll be another reason to make a special video for you. See you in the next one, where I'll be building Edouard's 1/48 scale P-51 Mustang B or C. See ya!